Welcome to ConCon, Consciousness Conversations. We are in the midst of discussing the Science of Consciousness Conference 2024. I am here in Tucson attending sessions, and Ben is back in Oakland, and I'm reporting back to him all the things that I'm finding for us both to sort of comment on and chat about. Does that sound about right?
I can't wait to hear what interesting, kooky, insightful, mind-blowing things you've experienced today.
Well, get ready for this because this was my favorite day of the conference. And looking ahead, I think that this is going to be the best one. But there's a kind of a novel approach to thinking about like a mental model that feels super resonant and powerful. It might be one that I'm kind of like pulling into my collection of ones that I pay a lot of attention to. So let's just jump right in. In the morning we had, in the last podcast we talked about electromagnetic fields kind of hosting consciousness stuff. And so they had a second part of this, and it's this dude, this kind of tall guy here, I think is Andre Bastos. And he is another researcher who studies these electromagnetic fields. And they have these like really detailed, this is some of my favorite stuff. There's been a few people that have kind of talked about the animal research they do. And they're like, hey, one of the guys was like, hey, if you're not into this, we can talk about this later. You don't have to watch this, whatever. I think it's an interesting thing that in this consciousness space, it's kind of like, there's no way around some of this stuff without, animal models. Although who knows, maybe with AI someday, we'll be able to model some of this stuff in a better way. But at that point, we won't need to understand consciousness, I suppose. We'll have it figured out. So they had like done a ton of mapping and had like electrodes and stuff across all of these different areas of the brain to try and test some of these things. And this was actually from a different presentation, but I brought it up here because a few people brought it up, and I'd never heard of this style of test before. Have you heard of the global or local oddball tests, Ben?
I don't think so. No.
So basically the idea is that you create patterns for people and then you violate those patterns. And so you can do it with a sound. So it could be beep, 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 boop, beep, 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 boop, beep, 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 beep. So you have this you create this local oddball, which is the beep, 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 boop. And then you kind of create that pattern, and then you create a higher order oddball. And the idea is that you have low-level systems that are kind of paying attention to the local oddballs, and high-level. I love that they use this term oddball, by the way.
Yeah.
Seems like but this is the term they use. And then you have higher order systems that pay attention to these like global oddballs, right? So this is like deviant. So I know what this tone is. I've heard it a bunch of times. And I know what this pattern is, and now it's violated some like global pattern. And so you could see this kind of scaling up to larger and larger things as you're, a human and you're paying attention to more and more patterns. You could think, and so one of the things people talk about is like you're on a drive to work and you get there and you're like, was I even paying attention? Because you just like on autopilot because nothing really resonated. So you're kind of in this like local oddball territory. So this was the. I'm not going to try and interpret this, and it's probably not that helpful for people that are listening anyway. But they basically showed these brain waves and how they are responding to these oddball changes, right? So you have kind of the local, and it's got, because of the way that they've mapped these electrodes across the brain, they can kind of watch these brain waves going one way and going back, and they can look at the differences between the local and the global oddballs. And the kind of takeaway is basically, as you would expect, these the PFC and some of these regions of the brain that more lately evolved are doing kind of downregulation. They're sort of identifying more of the global oddballs, if that makes sense.
So are they trying to localize Well, first of all, are they trying to map like neural responses to the oddballs to people's conscious perception of the oddball? Like if the person,
Yes.
if you ask the person anything weird happened and they went no,
So
and there was maybe an oddball tone.
the previous picture I showed you is actually from a session about trying to determine consciousness in babies. I think it was babies, and so that with kids they're able to sort of like do some of this. They're able to sort of do some EEGs, and they're able to kind of create oddballs really easily with them where they don't have language to report. And so you can see kind of when they become responsive to more global oddballs, and that's kind of an indication of a certain level of consciousness.
I see.
So so you could think of like a single cell organism being maybe responsive to only local oddballs, right? Now as the organism becomes more and more complex, it has to kind of pay attention to the more complex the patterns it's able to pay attention to, the more advantageous it is.
Yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is there a disconnect where maybe some part of your brain is responding to the oddball, but if you ask me experientially, my subjective perception of it, it's not there.
Oh, I think
You know
that's
what I mean?
100% what they're saying. Yeah, so you've got these like local oddball things that some part of your body is responding to, and but then you've got the global oddballs that might become conscious. And in fact,
okay.
as the and this dovetails in really nicely to this next one talk that I want to talk about, which is that if you this model scales really well, right? And this kind of Mark Solms talks about this in his book, where the pressure ultimately is to become less conscious, right? It's like processes should become automated as our genes adapt and improve. And they should kind of get pushed down into these lower buffers where you don't need to sort of pay attention to patterns around them. This was the guy that kind of blew my mind, and I went to. He has a YouTube channel. Let me make sure.
It's a nice man bun.
Yeah, I know, it's a great man bun. Justin Riddle is his name. He has a YouTube channel, and I was actually already subscribed to his channel. So I'm wondering if we saw him last year, or maybe I saw him a couple years ago. But he is at, where is he at? Like some Florida State maybe. And so he's doing stuff. I think he's doing some stuff with electromagnetic fields as well. But in the process of this, and they're thinking about these fields, they sort of developed a novel model for consciousness. And I don't know how novel it is, but it's interesting that it kind of like weaves together a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. So he's sort of saying that the things that are happening are a dialogue between different layers of the brain. That thoughts are kind of emerging maybe from lower layers, maybe fully formed, and we're sort of deciding to accept them. And that body control is this conversation that's happening, right? I think none of these are very provocative statements. I mean, I think they're provocative to like a naive person thinking about themselves, but to anyone in neuroscience, this is I don't think these are very very provocative statements. So his idea is that you have these this mosaic of tiles that sort of make up your conscious experience, that are these different electromagnetic maps, I believe, of cognitive experience and processes that are happening, and they're sort of tiled together, and but they also sort of scale down. And so he sort of talks about it like this, where you have consciousness is this apex piece of the hierarchy, and it's integrating information. I mean, this sort of sounds like a lot of these other theories, right? But that you have quote unquote kind of conscious type things that are emerging and bubbling up from these lower layers.
In computer science, we call these quad trees. What's being shown here?
Yeah, I mean, I think
you have quadrants recursively
Yeah.
turning into more quadrants.
And then I thought I had an image. So he calls this the now model. Let me see if I can find.
So what I'm seeing here, I'm seeing different quad trees and different amounts of the levels of the hierarchy of the quad tree are being shaded purple. Mm-hmm. And it says purple denotes a conscious observer window. Conscious observer. Is this implying that this is something I've heard, that, we think we have one conscious thread, but maybe the thing that is blabbing on and on using our lips doesn't have access to all the other conscious parts of our brain that are compartmentalized.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
So is that sort of an indication that maybe there's a bunch of conscious entities within us?
I think that's exactly the idea, right? And that in order to operate, you have, and you think about an early multicellular entity, right? Where it's each of those cells has stuff that it wants to do, right? And somehow it's got to subject itself into this like collective idea about surrendered about how they're going to sort of operate, and that would be the apex level of consciousness. And so I really like this because it seems like he's kind of more of an experimental, like a lab neuroscientist, and it was like, hey, I needed a model to work with, and we came up with this, and it feels really resonant. So it's called let me add this to the album here. It's called the Now model. Let me see if it popped in here. Where'd it go? Share it on the other one. So he talks about this mosaic tiling. He talks about this theater that's like a composite of all of these tiles, and then he talks about dialogue where you have these different regions kind of speaking to each other. But yeah, I think that one, what did you call that, quad tree? That was the most resonant to me. That feels so akin to, what I've been vibing with at this version of the conference, but also just like ideas I've had in the past. And I think it becomes a nice layer to think about the different things that people are calling quote unquote consciousness, right? Because again, if we sort of believe everybody, if we say like Hammeroff's like quantum stuff is having an impact, well, it's just one of those lower level things, right? If it's happening at this cellular level, great, but those cells are sort of needing to communicate up this hierarchy to sort of make their way all the way up to this apex that is actually kind of deciding. And so at each of those levels, you can have the attention schema theory, or you can have the, integrated information theory. And so, everyone's saying like, this is consciousness. And it's like, well, it's consciousness all the way down, right? Which is quite panpsychist in some ways. But if it's consciousness all the way down, then we can start to classify these theories as ways of talking about different pieces of that hierarchy, as opposed to, fighting about who's right and who's wrong. Which feels, very...
Good luck.
Probably my favorite moment in the whole conference was there's a Buddhist monk guy who's floating around, who's not like, he's not Dalai Lama energy. He's very like Karen energy, I would say. And he just like pops up in sessions and is like says very provocative things. So he got up in one of the plenary sessions, and he was like, do you think that there's he's like, I'm gonna give you a question and an answer. Do you think that there's a fundamental model of consciousness? And I'm gonna say yes, there is, and I have it on this piece of paper. And he holds up this piece of paper, and I can't really see what's on there. It's like a big one, like an 11 by 17 piece of paper. And he holds up this piece of paper, and all I see is on one side of it, it says meditation and vipassana. I have no idea what's on the other side. And he's like, I tested this, whatever that means, with 10 people yesterday, and they all understood it. So this is our base model for consciousness. And I was like, bold. And the guy, he's up there arguing with some academic from some like major university. And I'm just like, but that's what we love. That's what we love about this conference. Big tent.
Here's the thing, okay? I remember there was a guy last year who was doing experiments on consciousness using like dynamical models, and he was looking at basically how the loops in your brain sort of just unravel. It was really cool. It was data-driven, used a lot of fancy dynamic modeling. This guy was from MIT. You may remember this. It wasn't like a big session. And I looked around and I felt like, this guy's speaking to me. He's speaking my language. I know what this means. This probably means nothing to a lot of these people, like the Buddhist monk in the room.
Yeah.
Who, And the weird thing is, like, then you walk into one of these, Donald Hoffman, where he's talking about like abstract n-dimensional topologies. I'm completely lost. I think that's probably real math. But then you walk into, a poster session, and the guy says that A star equals B star with the C on top. That is not, I'm pretty certain that's not real math. The problem is, when you're the Buddhist monk, you have no way of distinguishing any of those. I don't have any way of distinguishing the Donald Hoffman. That's above my pay grade. And so I think this big tent thing is a fundamental problem, because certain people are walking around speaking over each other, through each other. Certain people understand a subset of what's being said. And then others, I feel bad for these people. They would have no barometer of knowing what's total BS and what's like real math. So of course you write it on a sheet of paper and you've convinced 10 people, and now my way or the highway.
I do feel kind of hopeful about it, though, in the sense that I think that if we think of this as the bottom of the funnel, I don't know, I met this guy, and he, classic profile, retired engineer, and was like, oh, I solved, this software problem. Let's solve consciousness. And he submitted a paper in 2018 and it got accepted. And then he was doing a talk this year with like Tononi and the integrated information guys, right? And it was proposing some like philosophical solutions to some of the problems that they have. And I'm like, you know what? That's great. Maybe there's this pipeline for some of these independent researcher folks. I don't think that's generally what happens. I think often it's you get really entrenched. Like you put that poster up, and now you got to defend it forever.
Yeah. Well, what is the Dunning-Kruger?
Yeah.
Is it a syndrome, or is it a phenomenon?
I think it's I don't think it's
the more education you have, the more you realize that you don't know, that you have gaps in your knowledge.
Yeah.
Whereas being in the unfortunate position where you have no knowledge, you have no capacity to know that you don't have any knowledge.
Yeah.
So you may be overconfident in the amount of knowledge you have.
Yeah, I would definitely question anyone who... I would challenge anyone to find a conference with wilder Q&As at sessions than this one. We've had questions about genital consciousness. We've had questions about, just like, and a lot of just monologuing. I've seen that before at other conferences, but...
I mean, is there a QAnon conference? That would be way wilder, I would assume.
Yeah. But they're all on the same team, they're not like... What this is so combative, because people are like in these sessions and it's like, I want to prove you wrong in this moment. All right, well, let's keep pushing on, because I got a lot of other really cool content from this day. Again, this was my favorite day, I really want to follow up with this Justin Riddle guy. I would love to have him on the podcast. Like he's just he gets it. Probably not a surprise that he's kind of this younger generation, we've talked about the Thomas Kuhn book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. Do you know about this book?
I do not.
It's where the term paradigm comes from. He invented it sort of, or resurrected it from, Greek or something, I think. But the idea of the book is that basically like scientific revolutions are never, like we sort of paper over them, the debates that happened until they were accepted, but they're brutal. And that most often, to have this paradigm shift, it's like everyone really defends this previous model to the death until there's this tipping point, and then everybody jumps over and we just forget about what had happened before. And that like most often people just have to die. You have these like really entrenched people that will not accept whatever, Einstein was super reticent about quantum, I think, until the end, right?
Well, I'm reminded of like, so this mathematician Peano sort of blew the door open in mathematics with regards to different cardinalities of infinity. And this caused such a huge uproar. There's like really funny quotes where there's just like the two camps dogging on each other, and they're just saying the most ridiculous, hateful stuff to each other. And it's like, I wish that had been taught to me in school.
Yeah.
Because it really, grounding it in these personalities, you go, oh, this is just a perpetual human struggle, and there's personalities involved, and there's ways to sway people by being... forceful with your math, but also forceful with your personality.
I'm kind of sad that it took me into adulthood and studying philosophy to understand that math is philosophy, and that's where it came from. And it's just like people playing with numbers and ideas, and it always just felt so concrete and absolute. It felt like unapproachable. you could only be wrong. You couldn't be right. There was no sort of way to think about it in an interesting way, which, is probably the nature of mathematics, where it's like we've progressed so much in that field that to get to the extremes is like really hard. But there's a bunch of
I agree. I mean, I think I had my mind blown. I don't. It was like the beginning of some book on the philosophy of mathematics, and it was just like, what even is a number? Like, we say the number 3 as it sort of maybe exists on its own, but it doesn't, right? There's 3 apples, there's 3 pencils, there's 3 people. 3 counts some number of things. 3 as an abstract concept by itself, it's the opposite of concrete and absolute, as the words you used for math.
Yeah.
Like, it is the most abstract thing, right?
Yeah. All right, well, let's keep pressing on here. So my favorite, one of the most memorable sessions I went to 3 years ago was from this guy George Masur. I would say he's the yin to Stuart Hameroff's yang in some ways. He's also an anesthesiologist. I think he's the only other anesthesiologist that I see that's like really active over here, and he's mega into psychedelics. So he's done a lot of really cool sessions about. He did this session about dissociatives that kind of like blew my mind about nitrous and ketamine and how these things work and whatnot. So he's as an anesthesiologist, they're really interested in how anesthetics work and how psychedelics work. So he did this entire session on. He's like, hey, we always talk about these two like spooky things of like, hey, we can kind of like calm down the brain and bring it down to this like non-responsive level with anesthetics, and then with psychedelics we can boost it to this like hyper-responsive state. And he's like, we very rarely talk about these things working together or in opposition to each other directly. And so he did this rat study where he administers ketamine at the end of like a cycle of like propofol and other stuff, and the rats, and he showed a bunch of videos, and they just like perk right up, and they're like ready to go from the.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I just love that this, it didn't feel like super profound, but I love this philosophical approach of like, hey, like thinking of, I wouldn't have ever typically thought of a psychedelic and an anesthetic as counter to each other.
So this slide that you're showing me says psychedelic reversal of anesthesia, and connectivity is mediated by 5-HT2, which is the serotonin family.
Yeah, so this isn't actually the ketamine one. This is a different one. But this this slide, you're looking at them kind of in this anesthetized state. And then you have this intravenous injection of, I think DOI is a similar compound to ketamine.
I think DOI is a...
Oh, it's a serotoninogenic, maybe.
Stimulating psychedelic.
Yeah.
But
and this one down here, they had given them some sort of drug that inhibits 5-HT2T2T binding or whatever. HT2 binding, yeah. So then you don't see the effect. So they're like, he's kind of demonstrating the effect. But yeah, it was really interesting to see that and just kind of hear him again and like be like, yeah, I love this guy. He's probably one of my favorite people at the conference, both times. This real quick, we're going to switch into. I went to one session by this woman that's talking about the EHEs. This is like the extra human experiences. So now we're back to the woo.
Back to the woo. We've got the 4 C's. Wait, so what is it with diamonds? Is it also 4 C's?
Clarity.
Carrot,
yeah.
clarity.
Yeah. So we've got.
But in this case, we have clairaudience, clairvoyance. I know that one. Claircognizance, clairempathy.
Precognition, telepathy. So what was interesting about this session was she actually they found a patient population with a bunch of brain scans that just had and they were able to like sort of piggyback onto this study and ask them a bunch of questions about these behaviors. Like, do you experience any of these things? Are you able to do telepathy or precognition or whatever? And so then they were able to look at brain scans of all of these people and to look at different regions of the brain and see if there was any effects. Can you
like, so it's like a delusion detector?
Well, it would be like, the idea is, and of course, one of the things they were looking at was the pineal gland, right? So the idea is like, okay, well, if you can do psychokinesis, is there any region of your brain? And it was like a pretty like dragnet like look across the brain. And again, these weren't people that were specifically targeted for this study. They were sort of piggybacking on, and they didn't have a ton of data points. That I think they're really just trying to raise money so they can do more of this research. But can you guess some of the correlations that can you guess if there was any correlations?
Well, I mean, my joke that what you've invented as a delusion detector would be that if there's a part of your brain that shows that you're delusional, these people all would have it.
Yeah. Well, there were no correlations. Yeah, they didn't find any brain regions that were consistent with any of these effects. So
interesting.
Data point one. Okay, so now we're moving into the AI section. So this was like an earlier session. This woman, Susan. No. Why do I have such a hard time with all these names? Something Snyder. Susan Snyder, yeah. So she's written some books. She's writes a lot of books about technology, and she's got a new book coming out. And she was talking about the global brain. If you were to guess what that was, what would you think it was?
Global brain sounds very idealism, kind of some Bernardo Kastrup-y kind of Alan Watts-y sort of thing.
It's more like, so I think there has been a bent that's like that, but it's technology mediated. So it's sort of new. Have you ever heard like the noosphere of like this large interconnected thing of the internet or like, and so the global,
the zeitgeist.
So the global brain is sort of like the Matrix. Like we're plugging into this thing, and we may or may not be excited about that. So it's like, you're going to have to wear wearables. There's going to be like these national tech companies that kind of get to be responsible for your consciousness to some degree. And, if we were to tie this back actually to the Justin Riddle theory about the apex kind of observer layer, what this really would say is that there's a new apex that's potentially emerging, which is the internet or ChatGPT or whatever you want to call it, that is going to direct a lot of your behavior potentially, and, one could argue that this is already happening with, content generated on Instagram or whatever. Like people get the likes and then they respond to the likes. And then, they're sort of part of this ecosystem where they're sort of churning things out for a piece of technology. So yeah, a lot of people popped up and were super stoked about this.
Well, okay. My immediate response to this, this is like React content. I hear what she's saying. I think it's pretty cool, but my response to this would be, our particular experience of consciousness, I think, is drivable from evolution and evolutionary pressures. We need to really believe in the pain we're experiencing in some sense, right? It needs to really feel bad, right? And that influences our behavior, right? And I kind of see us leaving evolution behind. When you look at like
big time
the proliferation of the internet, mass cellular devices, this doesn't look anything like evolution anymore.
Yeah.
It looks like something else emergent. But that makes me sort of a little bit wary that consciousness is going to just develop in this ecosystem, right? That in the same way that a bunch of cells comprise our body, and yet here we are at the helm, conscious entities of all these cells. These cells, these constituent parts, like have their own interests in some ways, but we are this culmination and we're conscious. I don't know if that is going to analogize perfectly another level up.
Oh, I think it certainly won't,
yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there will be an emergent thing with very interesting properties. I mean, just look at the stock market, right? That is a crazy emergent system that a bunch of people are contributing to. But I don't think the stock market's going to suddenly feel pain and feel experience.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think. Well, and I think that this would be a hot take from my perspective that would be very different from what you would hear from people at this conference, which is that I don't know that apex, that new layer, needs to be conscious to be functional. I think that people would say like,
oh yeah, 100%.
Right? So you could have an AGI who's directing the majority of human behavior, at least within pockets, right? I kind of think that this, if we do get AGI, there's probably going to be Chinese AGI and American AGI. You know, we're going to end up being, and if you thought of this, if this ultimately needs to look like evolution, we're not going to be one global brain. We're going to be multiple warring factions that are kind of like competing with each other over things. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think that so I'm now going to show you a slide that's even more provocative from another session. This is let me go back to one. So I showed you this already. So this is Tam Hunt, who we saw last year and spoke about. He's very into.
I like his vibes. I remember him.
He had asked great questions. He's very into electromagnetic fields, and I remember at the time being like, "This guy's crazy," and now I'm kind of like, "Oh, maybe he was on something." But so this is the end of his presentation, and it's a sign for a tsunami, like a street sign for a tsunami, and then it just says, "Get off the fucking beach. A tsunami is coming." So I think there's a lot of people in this camp. He asked people in the audience, he's like, how many of you think that we could stop AI if we wanted to? And it was like a couple of hands. And he's like, how many of you think this is absolutely inevitable? And it was like 80%. Then this was the most provocative slide. It says, what, do you want to read it?
Oh boy, developing AGI is like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets in the chamber.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you my ignorance about guns. How many bullets are in the chamber?
Six shooter.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Anyway,
wait, what is this? There seems to be a paper with a really cool cover art.
AI, unexplainable, unpredictable, uncontrollable.
Great title.
Yeah.
Love it.
All right, so there's a couple of. So I went to this AI session. I popped out to go see something else, which was not very interesting, and then I came back and I had kind of had my mind blown because you and I have been talking.
Wait, hold on. Sorry, is this still Tam? This slide? I love this slide.
This slide is
okay.
Tam.
Yeah.
So I came out. I went to this session. I popped out to go see something else. This was like such a great afternoon. I saw a bunch of different stuff, including the telepathy one that showed no correlation. So the last 2 sessions of this, so I came back to this AI one, and since last year we saw that presentation from the Blooms about conscious AI, and that just kind of blew my mind. I was like, I want to be thinking more about this. And there's been a lot of doomer stuff around like, oh, well, obviously we don't want to make a conscious AI because it could suffer and that would be terrible. And the last 2 people were like, let's make conscious AI. So you probably should be looking into some of the stuff that these folks are doing. I think, Ben, it seems like they're well funded from some interesting places. So this first woman, what was her name? Ida Elamrani, I think. And so she's with this Astound conscious AI project that's in the EU. And so they're basically like provocatively, hey, everyone doesn't want to make us make AI because AI could suffer. It could experience like all this suffering. It's like, well, what if we flip that on its head and say AI might have more pleasure than a human could ever have? Then we would be unjust and like not.
I don't like those arguments.
So basically, just every single argument that people make about conscious AI, they're like, yeah, but what if exactly the opposite? So they didn't talk. I don't think they talked too much about the technical details, but they talked about very explicitly. And they were using. Does this talk about it? Yeah, they're gonna. So they're gonna use Graziano's attention schema theory and global workspace to sort of work on a multimodal chatbot.
To your earlier point, how come the Bloom's model hasn't? How come that hasn't caught on more as because it's immediately implementable in my opinion.
Yeah,
this conscious Turing machine.
No, I agree.
Blooms. I did look up their paper, by the way, and it's got 30 citations since 2021. So I kind of want to do a little bit of a lit review there.
Yeah.
But to the point of, I don't know how much we want to go down this rabbit hole, but there's a growing movement called effective accelerationism, and also long-termism in these things. They're kind of offshoots in a way of utilitarianism, where
Like philosophically.
you say, hey, wait a second. Yeah, where you say, hey, wait a second, we're severely discounting the future pain and pleasure of the far future, right? Especially, let's say the population gets very large and we spread across the galaxy. From a utilitarian perspective, where you want to maximize, whatever it is they're trying to maximize, it starts to make sense to do things now that ensure that many, many, many people will be born and have pleasurable lives in the far future. It almost like starts to make sense to discount what we're going through now to ensure the long-term survival of the human species and future flourishing. Now, I think this is a super problematic and actually very dangerous viewpoint. And I am worried that some of the effective accelerationists, they're saying like, hey, if AI wipes out the planet, good. Like, it's better to have AI anyway because it can steward the planet better than we ever could. It's almost like you could imagine some of them flipping and being like guerrilla terrorists in the future.
Oh, yeah.
So to me, it's very problematic. That all being said, this is all I got triggered here because you basically said like, what if we can make a conscious entity and it can experience pleasure like a million?
Which is what she said. Right? That wasn't me. But yeah.
But that reminds me, there's a comment. What is it called? The utilitarian monster. Right. This is like a thing. Right. It's a thought experiment where an alien comes down to Earth and is like, I experience 10 billion times the pain or pleasure of any single human.
Interesting.
And then utilitarian would say, well, it makes sense to wipe out the human race if it makes this utilitarian monster
because every
happy.
person you eat is like contributing some amount of pleasure or whatever. Yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly.
I mean, one would say that is basically us in reference to, say, ants or mice or whatever. We're
yeah. So it's like she wants to make a utility monster, and that I find that very scary.
I don't think that's the goal, right? It was like that was like a provocative counter argument to sort of.
I mean, you did promise some provocative slides.
Provocative,
I'm just saying that one provocates me a little bit.
Okay, so even like again, the stuff that tends to speak to me most is the real mathy stuff. So I'm not going to pronounce this guy's name. His first name's Vikram P. Or Vikram, first initial is P. And so it's this guy. And he did a presentation about instantiating attention schema into a machine learning model. And it's not an LLM, but basically, and so like, I was like, man, I really wish Ben was here. I would bet you would have had a bunch of really interesting questions here. I remember us talking a long time ago about these papers where it was like semantically trained models were just like inherently more generalizable, right? As you sort of understood more stuff, understood more stuff about language, it could kind of figure out other tasks in an easier way. Am I characterizing that right? Does that resonate? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I mean, bigger models generally do better sort of across the board than smaller models that are fine-tuned for a specific thing. Like
this was about language specifically. That language was this like unlock that was opening up that it could sort of.
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of things. Like I think of the fact that like giving, let's say you just train a language model on English, but let's say instead that you give it all the languages.
Yeah. There's
results that show that's even better.
Yeah.
Why would that be the case? And even better for English production, that is.
Yeah. So this guy's basically saying like, hey, we're into. So he's from this AE studio. So something I think to look into. If these guys have papers, I think this would be really interesting. But basically, it's saying that. So if you see the baseline model that they've trained, so they've introduced this self-modeling where I guess the nodes are modeling themselves. Because he's able to like inject this at different parts of the stack in the presentation, but these self-modeling models are just 50% more efficient, basically. at getting to whatever computation that they're doing. And so, and he talked about this like RLCT. Do you know what that is?
I mean, every time I see RL, I think reinforcement learning.
It's a measure for the efficiency of an LLM, I think. But yeah, he said there's like some people in there had questions about that as well, and he's like, there's other ways you can measure this as well. But I just thought that this was super fascinating that he's like explicitly saying like, hey, if we're saying that attention schema is this like unlock to human consciousness, what if we add some attention schemaing to the nodes in an LLM? And it's like he got these like pretty dramatic results, and they're continuing.
I'm seeing it stands for real log canonical threshold.
That's right. Yeah.
I've not heard of this, but I'm seeing a lot of, I Googled it. I'm seeing a lot of things around it that I do understand, like the inherent dimensionality of a model. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I've been paying attention to the work on interpretability.
Yeah.
Or I guess it's called mechanistic interpretability sometimes, or a flavor of it. And it's always kind of this separate thing, usually, that you have a big network and you want to pry into the black box. You have this interpretability study. So you have these other models that are sort of figuring out what the thing is thinking as it's thinking. But to me, it always makes sense to couple them, right? If you can give a model sort of power over its own interpretability such that it can, give you explanations for why it's producing the stuff it's producing, not at the level of just a simple autoregressive model, but like it can sort of have a little bit of ability to peer into its own circuits. I think that's how you accidentally bootstrap conscious AI, perhaps, but I think that sort of would be a really powerful thing. So that sounds kind of cool if it's anything like what I've described.
Yeah. Well, I think both of these studies as well, it's so fascinating to me that people are jumping on the attention schema bandwagon, and it speaks to its like functionality and it's like the proximate nature of it to the human experience of what feels conscious to us, right? It's like this self-referential thing. Like so many of these other theories are so deep in the stack of humanity. It's like, oh great, even a firing of a neuron or whatever, it's like, all right, whatever. But the attention schema thing is like, no, why do I behave the way that I do in reference to myself? And it's like that's the thing that that's the closest to the thing that we're trying to model in an AI, right? If an AI had incredible theory of mind and great and it was able to pay attention to what I'm paying attention to all the time, it would probably do a really good job of predicting what I'm going to do next and also figuring out what is going to make me happy or unhappy. So it feels like quite resonant with the current moment. Cool. Anything else to discuss, Ben?
Well, we need to contact Hamarov and get him to get Graziano to the next one, and then I'm there.
Yeah.
Make him a keynote speaker.
Well, the next year will be one abroad, right? So probably in Europe. So maybe we should petition the people that are running it and say like, this is a crime that they haven't had an entire kind of like day on attention schema and how it's impacting things, and see what we can make happen. Who knows? We'll be like, hey, we have a podcast. Listen to us.
Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. This has been ConCon, and you can follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. And if you want to leave us a comment on YouTube, like and subscribe, we'd love that. And yeah, thanks so much.